There's a powerful shift that happens the moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop trying to prove your worth to someone who keeps pulling away. Silence, when used with intention, isn't weakness, it's presence. It's self-respect. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, your silence doesn't go unnoticed. In fact, it shakes them. It forces them to confront something they've been running from. Not just you, but themselves. This is the moment where the dynamic flips, where your absence becomes louder than your words ever were. And suddenly, the person who once seemed distant is now feeling something unexpected: embarrassment, frustration, and yes, even anger. The moment you go silent, something subtle but powerful begins to shift in the dynamic between you and them. Before, there was a rhythm they had grown comfortable with. Your messages, your effort, your presence always filling the space. Whether they responded warmly or distantly, there was a certainty they relied on. You would be there. And that certainty gave them control. Not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a way that allowed them to stay emotionally safe, never having to fully step forward or risk vulnerability. But when you pull that energy back, when you stop reaching out and allow silence to take its place, that sense of control quietly slips through their fingers. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's deeply unsettling for them because now they can't predict you the way they once did. They don't know if you're still thinking about them, if you're moving on, or if you've simply decided they're no longer worth your effort. And that uncertainty is where everything changes. You see, avoidant individuals are used to managing emotional distance. They know how to create space when things feel too intense. They know how to retreat when vulnerability gets too close. But what they're not used to is someone else choosing that distance first. They're not used to being on the outside looking in, without access to your thoughts, your feelings, or your attention. So they start to feel it. At first, it might come across as confusion, a quiet questioning of what's going on. Then it deepens into something more uncomfortable, a loss of control over the situation they once felt so secure in. Because now the roles have shifted. You're no longer the one waiting or wondering. They are. And that shift forces them into a position they've spent most of their lives avoiding. They have to feel. They have to sit with the absence of your energy, the absence of your reassurance, and the absence of your consistency. And in that space, their mind begins to race. They start replaying interactions, analyzing your last conversations, trying to figure out where things changed. But the truth is, what's really bothering them isn't just your silence, it's what your silence represents. It represents your independence. It represents your self-respect. It represents the fact that you're no longer operating on their terms. And that's what breaks their control. Because control for them was never about dominating you, it was about protecting themselves. It was about keeping things at a distance where they felt safe. But now, with you stepping back, that safety is gone. They're exposed to the very emotions they've been trying to avoid. And here's the part that matters most. You didn't take your power from them. You simply stopped giving it away. And in doing so, you reminded them, without saying a single word, that your presence was never something they were entitled to. It was something they were experiencing. And now that it's no longer guaranteed, they're left to face a reality they didn't expect. That losing your attention feels a lot heavier than they thought it would. When your attention disappears, it doesn't just create distance, it creates exposure. Because for a long time, your presence acted as a kind of emotional cover for them. Whether they realized it or not, your messages, your warmth, your consistency gave them something to lean on without requiring them to fully show up. They could stay slightly detached, slightly guarded, and still feel connected to you because you were doing the emotional heavy lifting. But the moment you stop giving that attention, that quiet safety net is gone. Now there's nothing buffering them from their own thoughts. There's no distraction in the form of your messages lighting up their phone. No reassurance in knowing you're still there, still invested, still reaching. And in that absence, something uncomfortable begins to surface. They feel exposed, not because you've done anything to them, but because your attention is no longer there to soften the reality of their own emotional distance. You have to understand, avoidant individuals often don't process emotions in real time. They delay them, they suppress them. They push them aside to maintain control and avoid discomfort. So when you were consistently present, they didn't have to confront what they were feeling or not feeling. Your energy filled in the gaps. But now those gaps are impossible to ignore. And that's where the exposure begins. Because without your attention, they're left alone with questions they didn't want to answer. Questions like, Why did they pull away when things were good? Why did they keep someone at arm's length who genuinely cared? Why does your absence suddenly feel heavier than your presence ever did? That's not an easy place for them to sit. So internally, there's a tension building, a kind of emotional pressure they're not used to managing. And instead of clarity, what often comes first is discomfort, a restless feeling they can't quite explain. They might try to distract themselves, stay busy, or convince themselves it doesn't matter. But the truth has a way of creeping in during quiet moments, because your absence has removed the illusion they were holding on to, that they could keep you at a distance and still have access to you. Now they're on the outside of that connection, looking in. And here's where it becomes even more significant. It's not just that they miss your attention, it's that they start to realize how much they depended on it without ever acknowledging it. Your consistency made things feel stable, even when they weren't fully investing. And now that stability's gone, so they feel exposed. Exposed in their inaction. Exposed in their emotional unavailability. Exposed in the realization that they may have misunderstood your value. And that exposure can be deeply uncomfortable because it challenges the image they had of themselves. It forces them to confront the gap between how they behaved and what they might actually feel beneath the surface. But instead of immediately expressing that, they often sit with it in silence, just like you are now, because they don't yet know how to articulate it. They don't yet know how to move toward you without facing the vulnerability they've been avoiding. And all of this started the moment your attention was no longer freely given. Because sometimes it's not your presence that reveals the truth of a connection. It's your absence. Embarrassment doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself the way anger does. It creeps in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, and then settles in deeper the more they begin to reflect. And for someone who is used to keeping emotional distance, that feeling can be incredibly uncomfortable because it forces a level of self-awareness they've been avoiding. When you were still there, still reaching out, still trying to make things work, they didn't have to question themselves too much. Your consistency allowed them to stay in a kind of emotional autopilot. They could give little, pull back when it felt intense, and trust that you would still be there. There was no urgency to examine their behavior, no pressure to confront the impact of their actions. But your silence changes that. Because now, without your presence filling the space, they're left with something they can't easily escape, their own memory. The way they handled things. The moments they pulled away instead of leaning in. The times they chose distance over connection. And slowly those moments start to add up. At first it might just be a passing thought. A brief flicker of, maybe I could have handled that differently. But as time goes on, that thought grows. It becomes harder to ignore. They start replaying conversations in their head, remembering your effort, your patience, your willingness to understand them. And then comes the realization. You didn't leave because you didn't care. You stepped back because they didn't meet you where you were. And that realization? It hits deeper than they expected. Because now it's not about blaming you or justifying their distance. It's about seeing themselves more clearly. Seeing that maybe, just maybe, they were the one who created the imbalance. That they were given something genuine and didn't fully show up for it. That's where embarrassment begins to take hold. Not the kind that makes someone laugh it off or brush it aside, but the kind that sits heavy. The kind that makes them question their own choices. Because it challenges the story they've been telling themselves. The idea that they were just protecting their space, just taking things slow, just doing what felt comfortable. Now, that story starts to crack. Because your absence is evidence that something real was lost. And deep down, they know it didn't have to be that way. That's what makes it embarrassing. Not in a superficial sense, but in a deeply personal one. It's the awareness that they may have misjudged you, underestimated you, or taken your presence for granted. It's the recognition that someone showed up for them in a way they weren't ready to reciprocate. And now, that opportunity isn't as easily accessible. But here's the part that makes it even more intense. They can't easily express this embarrassment, because doing so would require vulnerability. It would mean admitting that they got it wrong, that they feel something they didn't acknowledge before. And for someone who avoids emotional exposure, that's not easy to do. So instead they sit with it, quietly, internally, trying to make sense of it. And all the while, your silence continues to hold up that mirror. Not accusing, not demanding, just reflecting. Showing them without a single word that your absence wasn't random. It was a response to what they did or didn't do. And that's why it stays with them. Because embarrassment rooted in truth is the hardest kind to ignore. Anger, in this situation, is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. It doesn't come from a place of strength or certainty, it comes from discomfort. from being pushed into an emotional space they don't know how to navigate. And when your silence removes the familiar dynamic they were comfortable in, that discomfort starts to rise in ways they can't easily control or explain. At first, it might not even look like anger. It can show up as irritation, as a subtle edge in their tone, or even as indifference that feels slightly forced. But underneath all of that is something much more complex. Because what they're actually reacting to isn't you. It's what your silence is making them feel. You've taken away the structure they relied on. Before, they could engage when it suited them and pull back when it didn't. They could keep things at a distance while still knowing you were there. But now that predictability is gone. And without it, they're left facing emotions they've spent a long time avoiding. Uncertainty, vulnerability, even a sense of loss. And that's not an easy experience. So the mind looks for a way to protect itself. It tries to regain control, to make sense of what's happening in a way that feels less threatening. And one of the quickest ways it does that is by turning discomfort into frustration. Because frustration feels more manageable than vulnerability. It's easier to feel annoyed than to admit, I miss them. It's easier to feel irritated than to admit, I didn't expect this to affect me. It's easier to feel angry than to admit, I might have made a mistake. So that's where they go. They might start telling themselves stories to justify that feeling. Maybe they think you're being distant on purpose, that you're playing games, or that you've suddenly changed. Not because those things are necessarily true, but because it helps them avoid sitting with the deeper reality that your silence has impacted them more than they're comfortable admitting. And in some cases, that anger may even reach outward. They might become short with you if you do interact again. They might say things that feel defensive or dismissive. They might even try to provoke a reaction just to break the silence and restore some sense of familiarity. Because even conflict can feel more comfortable than uncertainty. But here's what's important to understand. That anger isn't clarity. It's confusion. It's what happens when someone who is used to keeping emotional distance suddenly feels something they can't easily push away. It's a response to the loss of control, to the exposure, to the realization that your absence has weight. And instead of processing that weight in a healthy, open way, they default to what feels safer, resistance. Because if they can stay frustrated, they don't have to feel vulnerable. If they can stay irritated, they don't have to feel regret. If they can stay angry, they don't have to admit that your silence mattered. But beneath all of that, it did matter. More than they expected. And that's why the emotion feels so intense. Not because you did something wrong, but because you stepped out of a dynamic that no longer served you. And in doing so, you forced them into a position where they have to confront feelings they weren't prepared to face. So when you see that anger, or even just sense it, don't mistake it for power or certainty. It's neither. It's a shield, a reaction to something deeper that they don't yet know how to handle. And the moment they begin to understand that is the moment that anger starts to lose its grip. At some point, after the initial confusion, the discomfort, and even the frustration, something quieter begins to happen within them. It's not immediate, and it's not always obvious from the outside, but internally, a shift begins. They start questioning themselves, not in a dramatic way, not out loud, but in small, persistent thoughts that keep returning when things get quiet. Because your silence has removed the distraction. Before, their focus could stay on you, what you were saying, how you were reacting, whether things felt easy or intense. But now, without your constant presence, that focus turns inward. And for someone who is used to avoiding emotional depth, that inward reflection can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. They begin replaying moments, little things at first, conversations they brushed off, times you tried to connect and they pulled away, moments where they could have said more, done more, shown more, but didn't. And at first they might try to justify it. They tell themselves they needed space, that they were just protecting their independence, that things were moving too fast or getting too serious, and maybe on some level those reasons felt valid at the time. But as they continue to sit with the silence, those explanations start to feel less solid. Because now, they're not just looking at what they felt, they're starting to look at how they acted. And that's where the real questioning begins. They start asking themselves things they didn't have to face before. Why did I pull away when things were good? Why did I hold back from someone who was showing up for me? Why does their absence feel more significant than I expected? These aren't comfortable questions, because they don't come with easy answers. And more importantly, they start to challenge the image they had of themselves. The belief that they were simply being cautious or taking things at their own pace. Now, there's a possibility they have to consider that maybe they were avoiding something real. That maybe their distance wasn't just about timing or circumstances, but about fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control, fear of being seen too deeply. And that realization can be difficult to accept because it means acknowledging that the situation wasn't entirely out of their hands, that they had a role in creating the distance that now exists. And for someone who is used to staying emotionally guarded, taking that kind of responsibility doesn't come easily. So they sit in that space of questioning, going back and forth between understanding and resistance, between moments of clarity and moments of denial. One part of them starts to recognize what happened, while another part tries to hold on to old patterns, old justifications. But the important thing is, something has shifted, because they're no longer completely disconnected from the situation. They're thinking about it, they're analyzing it, they're feeling it, even if they don't fully understand it yet. And all of that began the moment you stepped back. The moment you stopped filling the space, they were forced to confront what that space actually meant. And in doing so, they started to see things from a perspective they hadn't allowed themselves to before. Not because you told them to, not because you demanded it, but because your silence gave them no other option. And sometimes that's where the deepest realizations come from. Not through words or explanations, but through the absence of them. What changes everything in this dynamic isn't what you say or how perfectly you explain yourself. It's the moment you emotionally detach. Not in a cold or bitter way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way. The kind of detachment that says, I'm no longer going to overextend myself where I'm not being met. And when you reach that point, something powerful begins to take shape within you. Because detachment isn't about losing interest, it's about regaining control over your own energy. Before, your focus was on them, on understanding them, accommodating them, trying to make things work despite the inconsistency. You were adjusting, waiting, hoping. And without realizing it, that placed your emotional state in their hands. Their responses, their effort, their presence, those things started to determine how you felt. But the moment you detach, that dependence starts to fade. You stop checking your phone for their messages. You stop overanalyzing their behavior. You stop trying to decode what they feel but won't say. And instead, your attention returns to where it should have been all along, yourself. That shift might seem quiet from the outside, but internally, it's massive. Because now, your sense of stability doesn't come from their consistency. It comes from your own. You're no longer reacting to their distance. You're rooted in your own clarity. And that's where your power begins to show. Not in loud declarations or dramatic ultimatums, but in your calm, steady presence. In the fact that you're no longer chasing something that feels uncertain. In the way you carry yourself without needing their validation to feel secure. And here's what's interesting. They can feel that. Even if you're not speaking, even if you're not directly interacting, that shift in your energy becomes noticeable. Because the version of you they were used to, the one who was always available, always reaching, always trying, that version is no longer there in the same way. And that creates a contrast they can't ignore. They start to sense that you're no longer waiting, no longer revolving around the connection in the same way. And that realization forces them to see you differently. Not as someone they can engage with on their own terms, but as someone who has stepped into their own space, their own boundaries. And that's what makes detachment powerful. It redefines the dynamic without a single word. Because now if they want access to you, they can't rely on your old patterns. They can't assume you'll always be there in the same way. They have to meet you differently, more intentionally, more consistently, more honestly, or they risk losing you entirely. But the most important part of this isn't how they respond. It's how you've changed. Because detachment has given you something they never could. Clarity. You see the situation for what it is, not what you hoped it would be. You recognize what you deserve, not what you were settling for. And that awareness makes it impossible to go back to who you were before. You've raised your standard, not through words, but through action. And in doing so, you've shifted the balance of power. Not by taking anything from them, but by finally choosing yourself.